under the Freedom of Information Act. That's what we call a cover-up. They didn't want you to see that today. They didn't want you to see the before and the after, the redacted and the non-redacted. They didn't want you to hear from these witnesses about the detailed personal notes that they took. Ambassador Taylor took detailed personal notes. Now, they want to try to contest what Ambassador Sondland said about his conversations with the president. Because Sondland, after he talked with the president, talked directly with Ambassador Taylor and talked directly with Mr. Morrison and explained his conversation with the president. Well, guess what? Mr. Morrison and Ambassador Taylor took detailed notes. There's a dispute about what the president told Mr. Sondland. Wouldn't you like to see the notes? They don't want you to know the notes exist. They don't want to have this debate. They'd rather just argue, no, it's just about documents. It's just about when. We want the senators after 16 hours of questions before they can see any of this stuff. And you know what? Then we're going to move to dismiss the case. The when, as I said earlier, means never. And finally, the Clinton precedent. President Clinton turned over 90,000 pages of documents before the trial. I agree, let's follow the Clinton precedent. It's not even going to take 90,000 documents. The documents are already collected. You heard the testimony on the screen of Ambassador Taylor saying, oh, they're going to be turned over shortly. Well, we're still waiting. But they're still sitting there at the State Department. We didn't play a video for you of Secretary Esper on one of the Sunday shows saying, oh, we're going to comply with these subpoenas. Well, that was 1 week. And then somebody got to him, and all of a sudden he was singing a different tune. Yeah, they don't want you to know what these documents hold. And yes, we're showing you what these witnesses can tell you. We're showing you what Mulvaney could tell you. And yeah, we're making it hard for you. We're making it hard for you to say no. We're making it hard for you to say, I don't want to hear from these people. I don't want to see these documents. We're making it hard. It's not our job to make it easy for you. It's our job to make it hard to deprive the American people of a fair trial. And that's why we're taking the time to do it. I yield back.
The majority leader is recognized.
Mr. Chief Justice, I make a motion to table the amendment and ask for the ayes and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There is. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Aye.
Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Braun. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Ms. Ernst. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Gardner. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Ms. Harris. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Jones. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Lankford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mrs. Leffler, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McConnell, Ms. McSally, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Paul, Mr. Perdue, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young,
Are there any senators in the chamber who wish to change his or her vote? If not, the yeas are 53 and the nays are 47. The amendment is tabled.
Mr. Chief Justice.
The Democratic leader is recognized.
Mr. Chief Justice, I send an amendment to the desk to issue subpoenas to Robert B. Blair and Michael P. Duffy, and I ask that it be read.
The clerk will report.
The senator from New York, Mr. Schumer, proposes an amendment number 1289. At the appropriate place in the resolving clause, insert the following section: notwithstanding any other provision of this resolution, pursuant to Rules 5 and 6 of the Rules of Procedure and Practice in the Senate when sitting on impeachment trials, 1, the Chief Justice of the United States through the Secretary of the Senate shall A, issue a subpoena for the taking of testimony of Robert B. Blair, and B, issue a subpoena for the taking of testimony of Michael P. Duffy, and 2, the Sergeant-at-Arms is authorized to utilize the services of the Deputy Sergeant-at-Arms or any other employee of the Senate in serving the subpoena authorized to be issued by this section.
The amendment is arguable by the parties for 2 hours, equally divided. Mr. Manager Schiff, are you a proponent or opponent? Mr. Chief Justice, we are proponent. Mr. Cipollone? Mr. Schiff, the House managers can then proceed and reserve time for rebuttal.
Mr. Chief Justice, Senators, Counsel for the President. My name is Sylvia Garcia, and I am a Congresswoman from Texas in the Houston region. You know, I've been sitting for some time, as well as you, and it brought to mind the many years that I spent as a judge. Justice, all of you today are judges in this hearing. It's important that I say a few words before I start our argument for this amendment, because in the scheme of things, it's really not that very complicated. The American people, everyday Americans, know what a trial looks like, whether they've seen it on Perry Mason or Law and Order, or maybe they've been in court themselves. They know what a trial is. It's about making sure that people have an opportunity to be heard, both sides. It's about witnesses. It's about documents. It's about getting a fair shot. And that's all that we're asking for today, is to make sure that we give the American people the trial that they expect, to make sure that the American people know that this president needs to be held accountable. Because if it were they who were accused or alleged to have done something, they would want the same thing. So for me, it's about making sure that we get a fair trial, which is why I'm here representing the House managers to strongly support this amendment to subpoena Robert Blair and Michael Duffy. Blair and Duffy are the two officials who carried out President Trump's order to freeze vital military aid to Ukraine. Their testimony would shed light on central facts the House uncovered in our impeachment inquiry. Their testimony will further affirm that President Trump had no legitimate policy reason for the order. Blair works in the White House as the senior advisor to the acting chief of staff, Mick Mulvaney. Duffy is a political appointee. He works in the Office of Management and Budget. There he serves as the Associate Director for National Security Programs. Both were subpoenaed by the House investigative committees. Both were ordered not to appear, so both failed to appear for the scheduled depositions. Despite repeated outreach and despite their legal duty to comply, Blair and Duffy are not household names. Many Americans have never heard of them, but they operated the machinery of the executive branch. They implemented President Trump's instruction to freeze military aid to Ukraine. They communicated about the freeze with each other, with Mulvaney, with OMB's acting director Russell Vought, and with numerous officials at the State Department and the Department of Defense. They stood at the center of this tangled web. Some of their communications are known to us from the testimony of other witnesses before House committees. Other communications have been revealed through public reporting and the Freedom of Information Act releases. But these communications only partly penetrate the secrecy in which President Trump sought to cloak his instruction to freeze military aid to a vulnerable strategic partner. As plentiful evidence confirms, officials throughout the government were stumped, literally stumped, about why the freeze was happening. They were thwarted when they tried to get explanations from Blair and Duffy. Consistent with President Trump's effort to hide all evidence, Blair and Duffy have defied the House's subpoenas at the president's direction. To explain why this amendment should be passed, I would like to walk you through some key events which Blair and Duffy participated in. To start, Blair and Duffy were directly involved in the initial stages of President Trump's freeze of the military aid. On June 18, the Department of Defense issued a statement that it would be providing its $250 million portion of the assistance to Ukraine, and that Ukraine had met all the required preconditions for receiving the money. The very next day, on June 19, Blair, in his role as assistant to the president, called Vought, the acting director of OMB. The call was to talk about the military aid to Ukraine. According to public reports, Blair told Vought, quote, "We need to hold it up." That same day, Duffy, who reports to Vought, emailed Deputy Undersecretary of Defense Elaine McCusker about the military aid. Although the administration refused to produce that email to the House and all other documents, a copy of that email was recently produced in response to a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit. In the email, Duffy informed DOD that, quote, the president has asked about this funding release. Duffy copied Mark Sandy, a career official who reports to him and who testified before the House about this email. Sandy testified that McCusker provided the requested information to him, which he shared with Duffy. These communications raised many questions about Blair and Duffy, and they're in the best position to provide answers. For example, who or what prompted Blair to tell Vought that OMB needed to freeze the aid? Who? What reason was Blair given? And who instructed Duffy to reach out to the Department of Defense? Who told him the president had questions? And what were those questions? And did Duffy and Blair have communications about the military aid to Ukraine with the president, with Acting Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney, between themselves? What about the funding release and the president's so-called questions? Blair and Duffy could provide the answers. They could explain what directions they received, when they were provided, and who provided them. The American people deserve to know these facts. The next significant event in our timeline happened at the end of June. On June 27, Blair got an email from his boss, Mulvaney. Mulvaney was on Air Force One with President Trump. According to public reports, Mulvaney asked Blair, quote, did we ever find out about the money for Ukraine and whether we can hold it back? Blair responded it would be possible, but he said they should, quote, expect Congress to become unhinged. When did Mulvaney and Blair first discuss the president's freeze on military aid? Was there further discussion about the issue in this email? Did Mulvaney explain why it was so important to freeze the money, even if it would cost Congress, quoting again, becoming unhinged? Did they discuss why Congress would have such a strong reaction and whether it would be justified? Did Blair raise any objections to the seemingly unexplained decision to freeze the funds? The Senate could obtain these answers by hearing from these witnesses directly. Now let's move on to the implementation of the freeze. Despite Blair's warning about how Congress would react, President Trump ordered a freeze on military aid to Ukraine in July. Blair and Duffy were directly involved in executing the president's order. To be clear, certain decisions remain and were shrouded in secrecy, but key actions have been revealed. On July 3, the State Department told various officials that OMB was blocking it from spending its $141 million portion of the aid. More specifically, OMB directed the State Department not to send a notification to Congress about spending the aid. Without that notification, the aid was effectively frozen. Who from OMB ordered the State Department not to send its congressional notification? Did they give a reason? We just don't know. But remember, at President Trump's instruction, OMB and the State Department refused to produce a single document to the House. But the direction almost certainly came from Duffy or one of his subordinates, acting on behalf of the President Trump. We also know that on July 12, Blair sent an email to Duffy. Duffy's subordinate, Mark Sandy, saw the email and described it in his testimony before the House. As Sandy testified, it was Blair who conveyed that, quote, the president is directing a hold on military support funding for Ukraine. And that email only addressed Ukraine. Blair's email raises several questions. What other discussions took place about the president's decision to freeze the aid? Did the president or Mulvaney give Blair a reason for the freeze? Did Blair know that the president was holding the aid to pressure Ukraine to announce investigations of his political rival? We also know 2 days before Blair sent his email to Duffy, Ambassador Sondland told Ukrainian officials that he had a deal with Mulvaney. The deal consisted a White House visit for President Zelensky on Ukraine conducting the political investigations that President Trump sought. That is what prompted Ambassador Bolden to say he was, quote, not part of whatever drug deal Sondland and Mulvaney are cooking up. Blair is Mulvaney's senior advisor. Did Blair know about the Sondland-Mulvaney deal? Did he know that they were leveraging an official White House visit for the president to get Ukraine to investigate his political rival? The White House was unable to provide any reason for the hold. Throughout this period, officials across the executive branch started asking questions about the freeze on the military aid. Around July 17 or 18, Duffy emailed Blair. He asked about the reason for the freeze, but he got no explanation. Instead, Blair insisted, quote, we need to let the hold take place, and they could, quote, revisit the issue with the president later. In the House, we heard testimony from multiple officials, including Ambassador Taylor, who was until very recently our top diplomat in Ukraine, our numero uno. We also heard from several other officials from the Department of Defense, the NSC staff, and OMB, but no one heard any credible evidence, any credible explanation for the freeze at the time. No one, nada. Senators, think about it. Not even our top U.S. diplomat to Ukraine had any idea as to why the president had ordered the funds frozen. That is shocking. That should worry every single one of us here. Here are some of those witnesses. They're up in the slide. Again, no one else knew why. Why this decision made so secretly and without any explanation. Why was the president compromising the safety of a strategic ally in the region? Why was he harming our national security interests in the process? On July 26, Duffy attended a meeting of a high-level executive branch officials. Duffy made clear that the freeze on military aid was based on President Trump's express direction. But apparently, he could not clearly explain where there was a freeze beyond a vague reference to